Hello to all dear students. In the previous video, we all have studied about the primary data collection sources in detail. This is the continuation series of that video. In this, we will focus on secondary sources of data collection. So now let's explore the sources and get to know more about these sources. There are two sources we also know that are primary and secondary. Okay, and these primary sources we have studied in detail in the previous video. In this video, we are going to focus mainly on secondary sources. Total data collection sources are of two types, that is primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are direct personal investigation or indirect oral investigation, information from the local correspondent, questionnaire and schedule. And these all five types of primary sources we have studied in the previous video, that is the part 1 of sources of data collection. If you haven't watched that video, you can go and watch that video as these are very important. In this video, we are going to focus on the second part, that is the secondary sources. The secondary sources can be bifurcated on the two ways, that is published sources and unpublished sources. If we talk about the secondary data definition, we also have studied this in the previous video, but just to revise it, we can go through it. We can say that secondary data are those which are already in existence and which have been collected for some other purpose than the answering of question in hand. This definition was given by Blair. The another definition which says data collected by the other person are called secondary data, and this definition was given by Bessel. After studying these two definitions, we can draw some meaning of secondary data, that is the data which can be published or unpublished is always under the secondary sources, and the data which already exists is always the secondary sources. Now the main thing is here the primary data and secondary data differentiations is very important. If we look at the first point, we can differentiate between primary sources and secondary source data on the basis of component of originality, which means how much is the originality, how much is the originality component is between them. In the primary sources, the data are more original, and in the secondary sources are already in existence. So the first point we can conclude the primary data are more original and the secondary data are the sources which are already in existence. That are they may be original or may not be original. In the second point we can say the bifurcation on the basis of objectivity of the study. The objectivity of primary data is always related with the specific object of the study. We must be focusing on some specific point, but in case of secondary sources we need to adjust the published data as per our framed objective. In the second point we can conclude that primary source data with the objective is always fixed, it can never be changed. But in secondary sources data, you may be taking data from some other sources, then you can modify that there's objective in form of your objectives and frame some new objectives. Okay, now let's move the third point, the cost component. What is the cost of collecting data at primary source or at secondary source? Cost of primary data is more, while in secondary data collection we require less funds. So primary data collection is costly and secondary data collection is not that much costly. Now moving to the next point, the time component, the fourth point, that is time component. Primary data source require more time in the time of collection, and if you go through secondary sources the data can be collected in less time. So we can say that the time required in primary data collection is more, but it is less in case of secondary data. Next point number 5, which talks about the nature of data of primary sources and secondary sources. So, nature of primary data is in the form of raw material, but the secondary data is either in the form of work in progress or the finished form. So, this point talks about the type of data. The primary data are always in the raw material form, that are always at the starting point, but in the secondary data sources, the data is in the form of finished form or in the work in progress form. Okay, next point number 6. Let's talk about the biasness. Biasness, you can say the biasness means the discrimination, the tiltedness of one person's point of view towards his or her own personal views. That is called the biasness. Okay. If we talk it in the case of primary data, there is more possibility of researcher's biasness. But in case of secondary data, there is less possibility of researcher biasness. Next point, reliability. Seventh point, that is reliability. Primary data are more reliable as they are of original, and secondary data are less reliable, we can say. Now moving to the eighth point, that the precautions needed. What are the precautions that one should take at the time of collecting primary data or at the time of secondary data? Primary data needs more precaution at the time of collection. It means when you are collecting data by primary sources, then you should take more precaution at what time? At the time of collection of that data. But in case of secondary sources, you require more precaution at the time of its use, because at that time you have to modify it, you have to change it according to your own requirement. The last differentiation point, the accuracy, which talks about the difference between primary sources and secondary sources on the basis of accuracy. Primary data are more accurate, whereas secondary data are less accurate. Now let's move to the next topic, that is the methods of collecting secondary data. The main video content. There are two types, we know that is published secondary sources and unpublished secondary sources. Now we are going to study these both in detail. First one was the published secondary sources. There are many published secondary sources from where you can collect the data and go for it. Some of them are named here with their examples. Let's see them one by one. The first one, the international publication. All the international publication which are available are always published secondary sources. For example, the UNO, United Nations Organization, WHO, World Health Organization, IMF, International Monetary Fund, etc. These all are international publications that you can use for your published secondary sources. Second one, that is reports of committees and commission. Different reports are presented by different committees and commissions, and that are also published. You can take data from there also. Some of them can be reports of planning commission or the Niti Aayog right now in India, and the report of RBI, and many other reports you can get it online. The third source can be government publications. All the governments have some different reports, some different statistics, some different work they do, and all that work is available online, so you can collect from there also. The government publications can be the census report that is published after every 10 years. It was done in 2011, but till now it's not have been done afterwards. And the next point is national income statistics. Okay, these are the two examples that you can see for government publications. The fourth published sources available to us is the publications by the local authorities. Some local authorities which are governed by the government are also have some different publications, such as the registration of birth and registrations of death. That data you can get from their websites or their offices also. The fifth published sources that we have are the journals, the Indian Economic Review or the Indian Journal of Law and Technology. There are many other journals also available online, available offline, from where you can take the data. Some of them are we have studied till now. Some more we are going to study in the next slide. These are also the published secondary source data. In continuation of the previous slide, in the previous slide we have studied 5 published secondary sources, and these 5 more we are going to study now. So the publication by the research institute, it is the 6th published secondary source data that is available to us. Publications by research institute. Some research institutes such as ISI, Indian Standard Institute, or NCAER, that is National Institute of Applied Economic Research. You can get data from there also. The 7th published secondary sources available to us is the newspaper. There are many types of different newspaper that we know. Hindustan Times, the Times of India, or any other local newspaper that you study daily. The 8th published sources that we have is the publications by the professional bodies. These professional bodies can be Institute of Chartered Accountant or the Institute of Foreign Trade. The 9th published sources that we have is the publications of research scholars. All the publications of research scholars are available on the Shodh Ganga website of UGC. You can check it there and get the data from there also. The last source of published secondary source can be publications of commercial and professional bodies such as trade association or the stock exchange. Till now we have studied 10 published secondary sources. Now let's move some or see some unpublished secondary sources. Unpublished secondary sources can be anything, any data that is not available online, or either which is not as much known or not published at some recognized place. It can be diaries of some renowned person, or it can be letters which are available but nobody knows about those letters, and it can be unpublished biographies or autobiographies of famous personalities. So unpublished secondary sources you can make through on your own. So we have studied both the sources of secondary data collection, that is published and unpublished, in detail. So concludingly we can say the data which are primary in hand of one party can be secondary in the hand of another party. How is that? We know that the data which is collected for the first time is always the primary data, and the secondary data is which the other party is using. So we can conclude on this. Thank you all for watching my video by the Little Professor Ambika YouTube channel. I hope you all like it, share it and subscribe it. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.